In 1 Corinthians 3, Paul starts out like this. He says, "Dear brothers and sisters, when I was with you, I couldn't talk to you as I would to spiritual people. I had to talk as though you belonged to this world or as though you were infants in Christ." He said, "I had to feed you with milk, not with solid food, because you weren't ready for anything stronger, and you still aren't ready." Remember, Paul was writing this probably from Ephesus, and he had been in Corinth, and he had been face to face with them. He'd been sharing the gospel with them and teaching them. But what we're learning here now is that they were pretty immature as far as what they were ready to hear. And the reason is right there in verse 3. He says, the reason is because you're still controlled by your sinful nature. So don't get the wrong idea. He's not really talking about deep theological truths like sometimes we think this is talking about the church. A lot of times we talk about, whether we're just getting milk or solid food. He says really it's all about, applying it. It's not just about hearing it, some theological truth, but it's about applying the truth that you've heard. And he talks about the fact that they have jealousies and quarreling. And he goes back to what he had talked about in the first chapter. He goes back to sort of this petty desire that they had to follow leaders like Apollos or Paul or Peter. And so he says this in verse 6, "I planted the seed in your hearts, and Apollos watered it, but it was God who made it grow." And so here's the key verse for today. It's not important who does the planting or who does the watering. What's important is that God makes the seed grow. So Paul is talking here about making sure that your faith is centered on Christ. It's not centered on a person, a preacher, a church, anything like that. And that's a great lesson even for us today because we can fall into the same trap that the Corinthians had fallen into. In verse 10 it says, "Because of God's grace to me, I've laid the foundation like an expert builder, and now others are building on it. But whoever is building on this foundation must be very careful, for no one can lay any foundation other than the one we already have, Jesus Christ." So once again, Paul had started the church. It was his influence at the beginning that really made an impact on Corinth. And now there were leaders in Corinth that, perhaps these leaders were trying to make it about them. And Paul is just trying to remind the church, don't let any leader, don't let any spiritual leader make it about them. It is about Christ. Keep it centered on Christ. That's what it's all about. He says in verse 16, "Don't you realize that all of you together are the temple of God and that the Spirit of God lives in you?" And so he's trying to encourage the church in Corinth to be the church and to not make it about human leadership. So you're ready now to read chapter 3, and we'll see you tomorrow for chapter 4.